Sometimes the smallest amount of money reveals the largest truth about a person. No one inside the Grand Wellington expected that a single $5 bill would silence an entire dining room. The crystal chandeliers bathed every table in warm golden light, while polished glasses caught tiny reflections like scattered stars, and the quiet hum of expensive conversations drifted through one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants where billion-dollar deals were often negotiated over perfectly prepared steaks and vintage wine. At the center of the room sat Ethan Carter, a self-made billionaire whose name appeared regularly on magazine covers beside words like visionary, relentless, and unstoppable. He had built an empire from almost nothing, and over the years he had developed an unusual habit that none of his executives, friends, or business rivals fully understood. Whenever he visited a new restaurant, he secretly tested the people serving him. Sometimes he ordered the cheapest meal. Sometimes he dressed more simply than usual. Sometimes he asked questions that sounded unreasonable. But tonight, his test was different. Tonight he intended to leave only $5 after a dinner that cost more than $2,000. Not because he needed the money. Not because he was unhappy with the service. Simply because he wanted to discover whether kindness disappeared the moment generosity became smaller than expected. Across the dining room moved Claire Bennett, 27 years old, her blonde hair neatly tied back beneath the restaurant's elegant uniform, her calm blue eyes quietly noticing every guest without ever demanding attention. She had already worked nearly 10 hours that day, yet her movements remained graceful and steady, carrying each plate with the quiet confidence of someone who believed every customer deserved respect regardless of their mood. Other servers often joked that Claire smiled too much and expected too little from the world. They never understood that her kindness was never something she traded for larger tips. It was simply the standard she had chosen for herself. Ethan observed her throughout the evening without saying much. He requested sparkling water with fresh lemon instead of lime. He changed his appetizer after placing the order. He asked for a different dessert recommendation moments before the kitchen closed. Each request arrived with the same gentle smile, the same calm voice, and the same sincere, "Absolutely, sir. I'll take care of that for you." There was no irritation hidden behind polite words. No forced enthusiasm. No dramatic performance. Just professionalism that felt strangely effortless. As the evening came to an end, Claire placed the leather check presenter carefully beside him. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Carter," she said softly before stepping away to help another table celebrating an anniversary. Ethan glanced toward the dining room one final time before slipping his platinum card inside. A few minutes later, he signed the receipt. Total bill, $2,137.48. Tip, $5. He closed the folder without hesitation and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't watching the receipt anymore. He was watching Claire. Nearby servers exchanged subtle glances as they noticed the amount. One quietly raised an eyebrow. Another looked away, already imagining how disappointed she would be. Even the restaurant manager happened to notice the receipt resting on the table and frowned for a brief second before continuing his rounds. Ethan remained perfectly still. This was the moment that interested him most. Not the payment. The reaction. Claire walked over, picked up the folder, and opened it just enough to see the receipt inside. Her eyes rested on the number for only a heartbeat. No surprise crossed her face. No frustration. No disappointment. Instead, she gently closed the folder, walked back to Ethan's table, placed the crisp $5 bill beside his hand with remarkable care, and offered a warm smile that somehow felt even more genuine than before. The dining room seemed to grow quieter without anyone realizing why. Then she spoke in a voice so calm that every nearby table could hear every word. "Mr. Carter, thank you for allowing me to serve you tonight. Please keep this. Someday you may meet someone who needs to believe generosity still exists, and $5 might help you show them." She gave a small nod, wished him a pleasant evening, and turned away without waiting for a response. Ethan looked at the untouched bill resting beside his hand. For the first time in years, the billionaire who believed he understood people better than anyone found himself unable to move. Claire walked away with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, stopping beside another table where an elderly couple smiled as she refilled their coffee cups without being asked. She laughed softly at something the husband whispered, wished them a wonderful anniversary, and disappeared toward the kitchen as naturally as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet behind her, Ethan Carter remained frozen in his chair. The crisp $5 bill still rested beside his hand exactly where she had placed it. It felt strangely heavy now, as though it carried far more weight than its value. Around him, conversations gradually returned. Silverware touched porcelain. Crystal glasses clinked gently. A pianist in the corner continued playing a familiar jazz melody, filling the dining room with notes that somehow sounded different than they had only moments before. Ethan slowly picked up the bill and turned it over between his fingers. It was an ordinary piece of currency, no different from thousands he had carried throughout his life. Yet tonight it had become something else entirely. He had expected irritation. He had expected disappointment. Perhaps even a carefully disguised smile hiding wounded pride. Instead, Claire had offered him something he had not anticipated. Compassion, not for herself, for him. The realization settled quietly into his thoughts, refusing to leave. He looked toward the service station where several servers were preparing for the final tables of the evening. No one surrounded Claire. No one comforted her. No one whispered about the tip. She simply continued working, greeting each guest with the same warmth she had shown him from the beginning. There was no visible difference between the customer who left $50 and the family sharing one dessert to celebrate a birthday on a modest budget. Every person received the same attention, the same patience, the same quiet dignity. Ethan had spent decades believing that money revealed character. Tonight, for the first time, he wondered if kindness revealed something much deeper. As he stood to leave, the restaurant manager approached with an apologetic expression. "Mr. Carter, I hope everything met your expectations this evening." Ethan glanced once more toward Claire before answering. Everything was exceptional. The manager smiled with visible relief. "We are honored to hear that." Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before asking, "How long has Claire Bennett worked here?" The manager looked pleasantly surprised. "Almost 4 years. She is one of the finest people I have ever hired. Guests remember her names. Families request her section months in advance. She has trained nearly every new server who has joined our staff." Ethan nodded quietly. "She seems remarkable." The manager's smile grew warmer. "She believes every guest deserves to leave feeling a little better than when they arrived. That has always been her philosophy." Ethan thanked him and stepped outside into the cool Manhattan night. The city lights stretched across the streets like endless ribbons of gold, while taxis drifted through traffic beneath towering buildings that reflected the stars above. His driver immediately opened the rear door of the waiting sedan. "Home, sir." Ethan paused before answering. "Not yet." He settled into the leather seat, but instead of reaching for his phone or reviewing tomorrow's meetings, he stared through the window in silence. Normally, after one of his little experiments, he recorded observations in a private notebook he had kept for years. Customer service, emotional reactions, behavioral patterns, lessons about people. Tonight, he opened the notebook once again. He uncapped his pen, ready to write another conclusion. The blank page waited patiently beneath the soft reading light. Minutes passed. Nothing came. Every sentence he started felt dishonest before the ink even touched the paper. Finally, he wrote only 7 words. "Perhaps I was the one being tested tonight." He closed the notebook almost immediately. Those words unsettled him far more than any business negotiation ever had. Somewhere across the city, Claire Bennett was likely finishing another ordinary shift, unaware that a conversation lasting less than 1 minute had quietly begun changing the thoughts of a man who believed almost nothing could still surprise him. The following morning, Manhattan woke beneath a pale autumn sky that reflected softly against the glass towers lining Park Avenue. Inside Carter Global Headquarters, the rhythm of success moved with perfect precision. Elevators opened every few seconds. Executives hurried through marble corridors carrying tablets and coffee. Assistants reviewed schedules measured down to the minute. Yet Ethan Carter barely noticed any of it. Normally, he arrived before everyone else, reviewed international market reports, answered overnight messages from London and Singapore, and entered his first board meeting already 3 decisions ahead of the room. Today was different. As he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office overlooking Central Park, his attention drifted not toward financial forecasts, but toward a quiet restaurant several miles away. The image returned without invitation. Claire's calm smile, her gentle voice, the untouched $5 bill resting beside his hand. His executive assistant, Daniel Brooks, entered carrying a stack of presentation folders. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. The investment committee is ready. We also finalized the acquisition proposal for Chicago." Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "Move the meeting back 1 hour." Daniel blinked with surprise. "The board has already assembled." Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking again. 1 hour. Daniel had worked beside Ethan for nearly 12 years. He had witnessed billion-dollar negotiations, economic downturns, and moments when entire industries shifted overnight. Never once had Ethan postponed a meeting without an extraordinary reason. He quietly gathered the folders and left without another question. The office became silent once more. Ethan opened the leather notebook that had accompanied him through nearly every important decision of his career. He flipped through pages filled with observations, collected over the years. Restaurant servers who smiled only after seeing large tips. Hotel clerks who suddenly became friendlier after recognizing his name. Salespeople whose enthusiasm changed depending on the watch he wore. Every experiment had strengthened the same conclusion. Money exposed people. Status revealed intentions. Wealth measured character. Then he reached the final page containing only one sentence written the night before. "Perhaps I was the one being tested tonight." He stared at those words for several long moments before quietly closing the notebook. For the first time since creating it nearly 20 years earlier, he wondered whether the notebook had been documenting the wrong subject all along. Meanwhile, several miles downtown, Claire Bennett stepped off the subway carrying a reusable canvas bag over one shoulder. She stopped briefly at a neighborhood bakery before work, purchasing 2 fresh blueberry muffins and a large black coffee. The young cashier smiled as Claire handed one of the muffins back across the counter. "One for you. You have looked exhausted all week." The cashier laughed softly. "You really do not have to do that." Claire simply shrugged. Kindness tastes better when it is shared. A few minutes later, she continued toward the Grand Wellington, greeting the doorman by name before tying on her apron in the employee lounge. Her coworkers chatted about weekend plans, rising rent prices, and yesterday's busy dinner service. No one mentioned Ethan Carter. No one mentioned the $5 tip. To Claire, it had already become yesterday's story. She checked each table setting with quiet care, straightened a slightly crooked chair, polished a wine glass that already looked spotless, and smiled warmly at the first guests entering through the front doors. Across town, Ethan finally stood from his desk, picked up his suit jacket, and surprised Daniel with an unexpected instruction. "Clear my afternoon." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "You have dinner with investors tonight." Ethan fastened a single button on his navy jacket and reached for his car keys himself instead of calling his driver. "Reschedule it." "May I ask where you are going?" Ethan paused only briefly before answering with complete honesty. "I am going to learn whether yesterday was luck or whether I met someone who understands success better than I do." The afternoon sun stretched long reflections across the polished windows of the Grand Wellington as the lunch rush settled into its comfortable rhythm. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room with the same quiet confidence she carried every day, greeting returning guests by name, remembering which customer preferred iced tea without lemon, and placing a small bowl of fresh water beside the chair of a regular guest who always brought his golden retriever service dog. None of these gestures appeared in the restaurant handbook. They simply came naturally to her. A few minutes after 1 o'clock, the front door opened, and Ethan Carter stepped inside wearing a charcoal sport coat instead of the tailored business suits that usually announced his arrival long before anyone recognized his face. Without the entourage, without the waiting driver at the entrance, and without the commanding pace that often followed him through corporate hallways, he looked surprisingly ordinary. The hostess smiled warmly and led him toward a quiet table near the windows. Claire noticed him immediately, but offered exactly the same friendly smile she had given every other guest. There was no hesitation in her expression, no awkwardness from the previous evening, and certainly no expectation that today would be any different. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," she said. "Welcome back. It is nice to see you again." Ethan searched her face for even the smallest trace of resentment. There was none. "Good afternoon, Claire," he answered. "I hope I am not interrupting a busy day." She smiled gently. A busy restaurant is usually a happy restaurant. She handed him a menu, although she remembered almost everything he had ordered the night before. Would you like a few minutes? Or would you prefer your sparkling water while you decide? Ethan almost laughed to himself. She remembered, not because he was wealthy, but because remembering people mattered to her. Sparkling water would be wonderful, he replied. With fresh lemon? She asked. Yes. I will be right back. As Claire walked away, Ethan quietly observed the dining room. He watched her greet a young couple celebrating their first anniversary with the same warmth she offered an older man eating lunch alone while reading a paperback novel. He noticed her kneel beside a little boy who had accidentally dropped his crayon, returning it with a smile that made the child grin from ear to ear. She never hurried anyone. She never looked impatient. Even during the busiest moments, she somehow made every table feel as though they were the only guests in the room. When she returned with his water, Ethan decided not to hide behind another experiment. May I ask you something? Claire placed the glass carefully on the table. Of course. Ethan hesitated, choosing his words more carefully than he usually did during billion-dollar negotiations. Last night, were you upset? Claire looked at him with quiet curiosity rather than surprise. About the tip? He nodded. She folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. No, Ethan frowned slightly. Most people would have been. Claire glanced briefly across the dining room before answering. Most people have reasons that make sense to them. I have mine. Ethan leaned forward, genuinely interested. May I hear them? She smiled politely. When I accepted this job, I promised myself something. Every guest would receive my best service before they ever decided what I was worth. If I allowed the amount on a receipt to decide whether I had done my job well, then I would be letting strangers define my standards instead of defining them myself. Ethan remained completely still. Claire continued in the same calm voice. Generosity is a beautiful thing, Mr. Carter, but it loses something important when we expect it as payment for treating people with dignity. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Sunlight shimmered across the crystal glasses surrounding them, while quiet conversations drifted through the restaurant. Ethan realized he had spent years measuring success by numbers that fit neatly inside spreadsheets and quarterly reports. Sitting across from him was someone measuring success by something no balance sheet could ever calculate. Before Claire excused herself to help another table, she offered the same warm smile she had worn from the beginning. I hope you enjoy your lunch today. As she walked away, Ethan no longer felt like a customer evaluating a waitress. He felt like a student who had unexpectedly found a teacher in the most ordinary place imaginable. Over the next several days, something unusual began to happen. Ethan Carter kept finding reasons to return to the Grand Wellington, but for the first time in years, he arrived without an experiment in mind. He ordered simple lunches instead of elaborate dinners. Sometimes he stayed for only 20 minutes. Other times he lingered over a cup of coffee long after finishing his meal, quietly observing the rhythm of the restaurant rather than the movement of financial markets. He never announced who he was. He never asked for special treatment. He simply watched. What fascinated him was not perfection. It was consistency. Claire Bennett treated every person with exactly the same quiet respect. A young college student counting dollar bills before ordering a sandwich received the same patient smile as an attorney discussing mergers over an expensive bottle of wine. An elderly widow who visited every Thursday afternoon was welcomed by name before she even reached her favorite table near the window. A delivery driver who rushed inside between stops was served with the same care as executives wearing custom-tailored suits. Ethan realized that Claire never seemed to calculate whether a guest deserved kindness. She offered it first and allowed everything else to follow. One rainy afternoon, he witnessed something that stayed with him even longer than their first conversation. A middle-aged man entered the restaurant carrying a worn briefcase and wearing clothes that had clearly seen many years of use. He looked embarrassed as he unfolded a handwritten list while quietly asking about the least expensive meal on the menu. Some restaurants would have hurried him. Others might have ignored him during the busy lunch rush. Claire did neither. She pulled out his chair, poured him a glass of water before he asked, and recommended the soup of the day with genuine enthusiasm. While the kitchen prepared his order, she noticed him staring at a framed photograph of New York hanging nearby. Beautiful, is it not? She asked warmly. The man smiled. My daughter moved here last year. I finally saved enough money to visit her. Claire listened as though she had all the time in the world. When the meal arrived, she placed a small slice of warm apple pie beside his bowl. The chef made an extra dessert today, she said with an easy smile. He insisted someone should enjoy it. The man's eyes brightened with quiet gratitude. Please thank him for me. Claire simply nodded. Ethan noticed something no one else seemed to see. There had been no extra dessert waiting in the kitchen. Earlier, he had watched Claire purchase that slice herself during her break. She never mentioned it. She never accepted thanks. She simply disappeared to another table before the man could realize what she had done. As the guest finished his meal and carefully counted enough cash to cover the bill, Claire wished him a safe visit with his daughter exactly as she wished every guest a pleasant afternoon. Nothing in her expression suggested she expected recognition. Nothing about her kindness appeared rehearsed. It was simply part of who she was. Ethan sat motionless long after the man had left. His coffee had grown cold. His notebook remained closed inside his jacket pocket. For years he had believed generosity belonged to people who could afford to give away large amounts of money. Yet the woman standing only a few yards away quietly demonstrated another kind of wealth altogether. She gave away attention. She gave away patience. She gave away dignity. None of those gifts reduced what she possessed. Somehow they seemed to multiply it. Before leaving, Ethan quietly approached the restaurant manager. May I ask you something? The manager smiled. Certainly. Ethan glanced toward Claire, who was helping a young family settle into their booth. Does she always find little ways to help people without letting them know? The manager chuckled softly. Almost every day. She believes kindness loses something if it is performed for applause. Ethan looked back across the dining room. Claire laughed gently as a little girl proudly showed her a drawing made with crayons. For a brief moment, the noise of the city beyond the windows seemed very far away. Ethan finally understood why he kept returning. He had not come back to study Claire Bennett anymore. He had come back because being around someone who quietly lived her values made him wonder what kind of man he still wanted to become. The following week, Ethan Carter made a decision that surprised everyone except himself. He stopped observing from a distance and started paying attention to the places where his own life quietly reflected the habits he had never questioned. During a Monday executive meeting, a junior analyst nervously presented a proposal that stumbled through its opening minutes. In the past, Ethan would have interrupted within seconds, corrected the mistakes, and moved on. Instead, he waited. The young employee took a deep breath, gathered his thoughts, and finished with an idea that ultimately improved the entire project. As the meeting ended, several executives exchanged puzzled glances. Ethan noticed them, but said nothing. That evening, he found himself thinking once again about Claire Bennett. She had never rushed anyone. She had always given people room to become their best rather than judging them by their first imperfect moment. 2 days later, he returned to the Grand Wellington just before sunset. The dining room glowed beneath soft amber lights while quiet conversations blended with the gentle melody of a piano. Claire greeted him with the same warm smile that had become so familiar. Good evening, Mr. Carter. It is nice to see you again. Ethan smiled sincerely. It is good to be back. As she served his meal, he watched the effortless rhythm of her work. She remembered names without making a show of it. She noticed empty glasses before guests asked for refills. She thanked the kitchen staff every time they handed her a plate, even during the busiest moments. She treated respect as though it belonged to everyone equally. After dinner, Ethan remained seated, while Claire delivered the check. This time he reached into his jacket pocket before opening the folder. He carefully unfolded the same $5 bill she had returned to him days earlier. It had remained inside his wallet ever since, untouched. He placed it gently on the table between them. Claire recognized it immediately. Her expression softened with quiet curiosity. You kept it, she said. Ethan nodded. I realized it was worth much more than $5. Claire looked at him without speaking. Ethan continued slowly, choosing each word with care. I spent years believing I understood people because I knew how they reacted when they were being evaluated. I thought every test taught me something about them. I never stopped to wonder what those tests revealed about me. Claire remained silent, allowing him to finish at his own pace. You told me something without trying to teach me. You showed me that dignity is not something people earn after they prove themselves. It is something they deserve before they ever have the chance. A quiet smile appeared on Claire's face. People usually become exactly what we expect them to become, she replied softly. When someone feels respected, they often begin respecting themselves even more. Sometimes all we really give another person is the chance to remember their own value. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. Those words settled inside him with surprising force. They explained something he had never been able to understand despite decades of leading thousands of employees. He had built successful companies by demanding excellence. But perhaps excellence also grew where people felt trusted. Before Claire returned to her other tables, Ethan asked one final question. Has anyone ever disappointed you after you treated them with kindness? Claire smiled gently. Of course. Ethan looked surprised. Then why continue? She glanced toward the dining room, where guests laughed together beneath the warm lights. Because I choose my values before I meet people. If someone else forgets theirs, I do not have to forget mine. Ethan watched her walk away, carrying another tray with the same graceful confidence he had come to admire. He realized that her philosophy required far more strength than any business strategy he had ever created. It asked nothing from other people before asking everything from herself. Sitting alone beneath the quiet glow of the chandeliers, Ethan carefully folded the $5 bill once more and returned it to his wallet. It no longer reminded him of a failed experiment. It had become a quiet promise that the next person he evaluated would first be treated with the respect every human being deserves. Several days passed, and the quiet transformation inside Ethan Carter became visible to people who had known him for years. It was never dramatic. There were no speeches, no public announcements, no headlines. The changes appeared in moments so small that most people would have overlooked them. During a leadership meeting, he thanked the maintenance staff before addressing the executives. He stayed after a presentation to compliment an intern whose careful research had strengthened the entire project. He began asking receptionists about their families instead of walking past them while reading emails. The employees at Carter Global noticed something different, but could not quite explain it. The atmosphere inside the building felt lighter. Conversations became warmer. Managers who had always followed Ethan's example slowly began doing the same. Respect, it seemed, moved through an organization much the way sunlight filled a room. Quietly, naturally, without demanding attention. One Friday afternoon, Ethan returned once again to the Grand Wellington. This time the restaurant was unusually busy. Every table was occupied, and the staff moved with practiced efficiency through the crowded dining room. Claire noticed him entering and greeted him with her familiar smile before excusing herself to help another guest whose young daughter had accidentally spilled a glass of apple juice. Instead of calling another employee, Claire knelt beside the embarrassed little girl and handed her a clean napkin with gentle reassurance. Accidents happen, she said kindly. Sometimes the happiest memories begin with a little mess. The child's worried expression immediately softened into a smile. Her parents looked visibly relieved. Ethan watched the scene unfold without interruption. Years earlier, he might have measured that interaction by efficiency. Today he measured it by humanity. As lunch continued, another unexpected moment caught his attention. A newly hired server carrying a large tray became flustered while delivering several meals. She quietly admitted to Claire that she had entered the wrong table number into the ordering system. The young woman looked as though she expected criticism. Instead, Claire smiled encouragingly. Everyone here has made that mistake, she said softly. Take a deep breath. We will fix it together. There was no frustration in her voice. No embarrassment. She calmly helped reorganize the orders, apologized to the waiting guests with complete sincerity, and thanked them for their patience. Rather than becoming irritated, the guests responded with understanding. Ethan realized that Claire possessed a remarkable ability. She protected people's dignity even when they had made mistakes. Later that afternoon, after most customers had left, Ethan remained seated with a cup of coffee while Claire wiped down the nearby tables. Sunlight streamed gently through the tall windows, casting long reflections across the polished wooden floor. May I ask you another question? Ethan said. Claire smiled. You always ask thoughtful ones. Ethan looked around the quiet dining room before speaking. You seem to believe people can become better if someone believes in them first. Has that always been true for you? Claire paused for a moment, thoughtfully folding the cleaning cloth in her hands. Not always, she answered honestly. There was a time when I believed I had to earn respect before I deserved it. Someone changed that for me many years ago. Ethan listened carefully. Claire continued with a peaceful smile. An old restaurant owner once told me that every person who walks through the front door is carrying something invisible. Worry, grief, hope, loneliness, celebration. We almost never know which one. So he said, "Treat everyone gently. You might be serving far more than dinner." Ethan lowered his eyes as those words settled into his heart. He suddenly understood why Claire's kindness never seemed forced. It was not based on assumptions about people. It was based on humility. She never believed she knew the whole story of anyone she met. As Ethan quietly finished his coffee, he realized the greatest lesson he had received had never been about tipping, wealth, or success. It was about seeing people before judging them, listening before measuring them, and remembering that the most valuable thing one human being could offer another was not money at all, but the simple assurance that they mattered. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than expected, dusting the sidewalks of Manhattan with a thin layer of white that softened the city's relentless pace. Inside Carter Global headquarters, employees noticed another quiet change. Ethan Carter had removed the phrase that had hung for years in the executive conference room. It had read, "Results define people." In its place now hung a simple framed sentence. "Character shapes results." No press release announced the change. No company newsletter explained it. Yet everyone who walked into the room paused for just a second, reading those words before taking their seats. Some smiled. Others simply nodded. Daniel Brooks noticed it immediately. During a meeting later that morning, he watched Ethan thank the custodial team that had prepared the building after the overnight snowstorm before speaking to the senior leadership group. It lasted less than 30 seconds, but the room felt different afterward. Appreciation, Daniel realized, required almost no time, yet somehow changed the atmosphere of an entire day. That afternoon, Ethan found himself walking once again toward the Grand Wellington, carrying nothing except the folded $5 bill inside his wallet. The restaurant glowed warmly against the cold gray afternoon, its windows fogged slightly by the comforting heat inside. Claire Bennett was arranging fresh flowers near the entrance when she noticed him. Her smile appeared as naturally as always. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter." "Good afternoon, Claire. Your usual table?" He smiled. "If it is available." "It has. Been waiting for you." Ethan laughed softly. "You make it sound as though the table knew I was coming." Claire gently straightened a small white lily in the centerpiece before answering. Sometimes familiar places remember familiar people. During lunch, they spoke very little. Neither seemed uncomfortable with the silence. Ethan had spent most of his life believing every conversation needed a purpose, every meeting required an agenda, and every relationship produced measurable value. Sitting quietly while snowflakes drifted beyond the windows somehow felt more meaningful than many of the negotiations that had built his fortune. As Claire cleared his plate, Ethan finally spoke. "May I tell you something I have never admitted to anyone?" She nodded. "Of course." He took a slow breath. "For years I believed I understood people because I could predict how they would react under pressure. I called them lessons, experiments, tests. The truth is," he paused, searching for words that felt honest enough, "I was afraid." Claire looked at him with gentle curiosity rather than surprise. "Afraid of what?" "Of trusting the wrong people. Of being valued only because of my money. Of never knowing whether kindness toward me was genuine or purchased by success." Claire listened without interrupting. "So I tested everyone before allowing myself to trust them." Ethan looked down at his hands. "Eventually, I stopped noticing that every test began with suspicion instead of respect." Claire remained quiet for several moments. The only sound between them was the soft music drifting through the dining room and the distant clink of silverware against porcelain. Finally, she spoke. "When people expect disappointment, they often build walls so carefully that even genuine kindness cannot find its way inside." Ethan slowly nodded. "That sounds exactly like what I did." Claire smiled gently. "Walls can protect us for a season. They just cannot become the place where we choose to live." Those words settled into Ethan's heart with remarkable clarity. They did not accuse him. They did not judge him. They simply illuminated a truth he had spent years avoiding. He reached into his wallet and carefully placed the familiar $5 bill on the table between them one final time. "I think this belongs to the person who changed its value." Claire looked at the bill but did not pick it up. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and removed a small folded note. She placed it beside the bill with a quiet smile. "Then perhaps we should trade." Ethan unfolded the note. Written in careful handwriting were only 2 short sentences. "The value of kindness is never determined by the amount that accompanies it. The people who change us rarely realize they have done so." Ethan looked up, his eyes warm with quiet gratitude. Claire gently slid the $5 bill back toward him once again. "Keep it," she said softly. "Not as a reminder of who you were, as a reminder of who you decided to become." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Beyond the windows, the snow continued to fall across the city, covering busy streets with a peaceful blanket of white. Inside the restaurant, surrounded by ordinary conversations and familiar faces, Ethan understood that the greatest investment he would ever make would not appear on a financial statement. It would be measured in the people who felt more respected after crossing his path than they had before meeting him. Winter settled gently over Manhattan, and with each passing week the city continued its restless rhythm. But for Ethan Carter, something essential had become remarkably still. The endless race for one more achievement no longer felt quite as urgent. Success had not become less important. It had simply found its proper place. At Carter Global, employees gradually stopped talking about the changes because they had become the new normal. Executives now remained in meetings long enough to hear junior voices. Managers were encouraged to recognize quiet acts of integrity as often as impressive results. Every new employee attended an orientation that included a simple message Ethan had written himself. "The way we treat people will always outlast the numbers we produce." No one outside the company knew where those words had come from. Ethan never explained them. He did not need to. The lesson belonged to the person who had taught it without ever intending to. One crisp December evening, Ethan visited the Grand Wellington one final time before leaving for the holidays. The restaurant glowed with soft lights wrapped around evergreen garlands, while a piano carried familiar Christmas melodies through the dining room. Families gathered around candlelit tables. Friends exchanged laughter over warm meals. The entire room seemed wrapped in quiet gratitude. Claire Bennett greeted him with the same peaceful smile she had worn on the very first evening they met. Nothing about her had changed. She still moved with calm confidence. She still remembered names. She still thanked the kitchen staff after every plate. She still treated every guest as though they mattered long before they ever opened a wallet. Ethan realized that while his life had been transformed, Claire had never needed to change. She had already been living according to the values he was only beginning to understand. After finishing dinner, Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a plain white envelope. There was no company logo, no business card, no contract waiting inside. He placed it quietly on the table before Claire returned with the receipt. She looked at the envelope and then back at him with gentle curiosity. "This is for you," Ethan said softly. "It is not money." Claire smiled. "Then I will happily accept it." After he left the restaurant, she waited until the evening rush had settled before opening the envelope in the employee lounge. Inside rested a single handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored paper. It read, "Dear Claire, when we first met, I believed I was measuring another person's character. Instead, I discovered my own. You never embarrassed me. You never judged me. You simply lived your values so consistently that they quietly exposed everything I still needed to learn. Because of you, conversations inside my company sound different. Decisions feel different. People are being treated differently. None of them know your name, yet your kindness reaches them every day through choices they will never realize began with you. You once returned $5 because you believed. Generosity should never be measured by money alone. Today I finally understand. Thank you for reminding me that respect should never be a reward. It should be the beginning of every human interaction. With sincere gratitude, Ethan Carter." Claire finished reading and quietly folded the letter back into the envelope. Her eyes glistened, not because she had changed someone's fortune, but because someone had allowed himself to change. She slipped the letter carefully into her bag beside the notebook, where she kept birthday cards from regular customers, drawings from children, and little reminders that ordinary moments often carried extraordinary meaning. The next morning she returned to work exactly as she always had. She greeted the baker delivering fresh bread. She held the front door open for an elderly couple. She smiled warmly as the first guests entered for breakfast. There was no celebration, no announcement, no audience applauding the quiet difference one person had made in another's life. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently onto the sidewalks, disappearing as thousands of people hurried toward places they believed mattered most. Inside the restaurant, Claire welcomed another guest with the same calm kindness she had offered from the beginning. never knowing whose life might quietly change next. And somewhere across the city, inside a well-worn leather wallet, a simple $5 bill remained carefully folded, no longer a reminder of a test, but a reminder that the richest people are not those who have the most to give, but those who never stop giving respect before expecting to receive it.